Welcome. Welcome to whoever is watching via YouTube. Welcome to those who've joined in via conference room. Thank you so much for joining in. So let's begin by giving away everything that doesn't feel good. It doesn't have to be big. It can be that little thought about maybe, like for example, I have a decision to make later today. It's not a big decision, and yet there's a little bit of worry happening. What do I do? Oh, I want to do the right thing. But what about this? What about? So I'm just going to hand that over to Bruno, hand that over to God. And if there's anything you're carrying, whether it's little or big, you can hand it over. You can ask for help. A big part of this path is about being humble, admitting, hey, I need help. It can be hard for us as human beings to admit that, and yet that's what Bruno spoke about, that when someone has tried everything else, and in this case I believe he was talking more about illness, but regardless, when a person has tried everything else, when the doctors have given up on someone, at that point we become open. And that was my experience when my body was falling apart. I was a devout agnostic. I was convinced we can't know whether there is a God. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but we can't know as human beings. I was so convinced. Then once my body started to get into really, really bad shape, and then I heard about Bruno Gröning and I heard other people, I was open. I was willing to explore. So that place of, admitting that we need help, it can seem hard and it can seem like the last thing we want to do, right? But it can lead us to such a place of openness. And I've come to understand, and I'll talk a little bit about that today, that this coming to a place of humility, coming to this recognition that we need God, in a sense, is the beginning and the end of this path. That's what this path is all about. And it's my understanding that this is exactly what Jesus taught. Is a very specific kind of humility. Now, humility doesn't mean shame. It doesn't mean judging, like, oh, I'm so weak, or oh, I'm so bad. Like that's humiliation. What we're talking about is an honest recognition of what we're able to do and what we're not able to do. Ultimately, to me, humility is just a kind of simple honesty. And I'll speak more about that in a little bit. So let's recognize we need help. For example, I just right here, right now, I recognized, okay, I have these thoughts and this little bit of worry about what to do today. I need help. So I'm going to hand over that worry and that situation. Let's just hand over everything that doesn't feel good. Doubts, fears, judgments, concerns, the future. Let's entrust the future to God. Let's give away the past. Let's give away resentment. Bruno taught us that when other people treat us not well, it's because they're, when someone's drunk or intoxicated, they don't behave well. In American English, we call it under the influence of alcohol, meaning their behavior, they're not fully a choice. They're literally being influenced and directed by an outside force, in this case, an outside force that they took in, but regardless, they're under the influence. If someone's treating us badly, they're under the influence of evil. Now, that's not to excuse their behavior, but it's to help us not resent and judge them, because that actually hurts us. So let's give away resentment, recognizing that those who have harmed us were under the influence of evil. And having given all these things away, let's really ask God, really ask Bruno to help us take in what's good. Really fiercely determine, I don't want to have anything in common with evil anymore. We can make that decision and then we can strengthen it every day. Become more and more vigilant. And accept our humanity, that we're on a path. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back. What's important is that we're on a path, that there is a higher power for which all things are possible. And we have a very fierce helper. Bruno Guarnian is more than a helper. He's a warrior for us. He's a knight. He said, I am fighting for you. So let's take that to heart. Not only do we have infinite God, unfathomable infinite God, we have a spiritual warrior who is fighting for us. So let's spend a little time resting our trust, our faith in God, our trust in Bruno Guarnian, and observe the body, noticing the sensations with the intention to take in what's good and to release what's not good. remembering as we observe our bodies, and this is a paraphrase of something Bruno Groening said, that actually I think it's a direct quote, that every sensation is now a step towards your healing. So as we're observing our bodies, every sensation we feel, according to Bruno Groening, is now a step towards our healing, towards our recovery. Really welcoming what's good into our bodies. So I'd like to offer a prayer, and please join in. And if the words I say don't exactly resonate for you, you're welcome to translate them. Beloved Maker, God, our dear friend Bruno, please, for everyone who is attending this gathering, and everyone who watches the recording of this community hour, please, the highest blessing, healing. Please help each person directly feel the presence of God, to be directly touched by God. Please guide each of us during this community hour and every moment of our day so that we can make the best use of our time here on this beautiful, beautiful planet. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining in. Wow. We've got 11 people combining the conference room with the YouTube channel, and I'm delighted. Thank you so much. Yeah, well, we've got 11 plus our dear friend Bruno, so there's at least 12. So, I experienced quite a delight the other day. I attended a Christian Scientist service, and I was shocked, pleasantly shocked. Well, first of all, I like to explore different traditions, different denominations, even different religions. The teachings of Bruno Groening are really the foundation of what I practice and believe in. And from that place, I find I'm able to connect with and interact with people of all faiths and even people of no faith. My sense is that what Bruno was teaching us was really sort of very universal and very much, well, I don't know if Bruno ever called it that, but Greta Hausler, who knew Bruno Gröning quite well, said that Bruno Gröning knew the rules of the game of life. And I think that's accurate. I think Bruno, not from studying books, but from a direct connection to God, understood how life works and communicated that very simply and very clearly to us. So if we focus on the essence, then we can connect with anyone of any faith. Or I'm starting to find that more and more. So I went to this Christian Science service and I was just pleasantly shocked. Some of the language was a little different, but in essence, there were definitely some differences, but in essence, it was what Bruno Gröning taught. And I'd like to read the first line from the text that the Christian Scientists use. And just very briefly, Christian Science considers itself, in a sense, an interpretation of what Christ taught. And so here's the first line from, they wouldn't say an interpretation, but how to live and practice what Christ taught. And here's the first line from their book. The prayer that reforms the sinner and heals the sick is an absolute faith that all things are possible in God. So again, I'll read that again. The prayer that reforms the sinner and heals the sick is an absolute faith that all things are possible in God. Sounds familiar. Sounds very familiar to me. So I was quite struck. And it always delights me when, something that Bruno taught us, I'm able to find in another tradition. I'm not sure why, but I just take such pleasure in it. And in some way, it deepens my faith that what Bruno Gröning taught us was really the essence that underlies many, many, many traditions. And I'd like to read one more line that was in the preface, which in essence, these are the first, what I just read was the first line in chapter 1. Now I'm going to read the first line in the book. To those leaning on the sustaining infinite, today is big with blessings. Again, to those leaning on the sustaining infinite, today is big with blessings. So first of all, there's the reminder, which Bruno, that it's the infinite that sustains us. It's so easy to look around and be, oh, this house, my job, my relationships, those are the things that sustain me. It's so easy to think that, but is it true? Certainly those things contribute, give value, but Bruno Gröning reminded us that we belong to God, that we're literally dependent on God. And, he specifically spoke, he said, the little bread giver, meaning an employer, the little bread giver may give up on you, meaning you may get fired, but the big bread giver, God, will never give up on you. So again, here's this line. To those leaning on the sustaining infinite, today is big with blessings. Leaning, that's the question, friends. What are we leaning on? As human beings, we're not independent. As much as we like to think we're independent and all-powerful, we're really not. And in my case, it was my physical health, where I was headed to death at the age, I think this body was 40 years young, and I had a year or two left to live. Talk about realizing how not independent I was and how not all-powerful I was. So that's really what I believe Bruno, in essence, came to teach us, to lean on God, to depend on God. And lastly, and the woman who wrote this book, Mary, her name is Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the Christian Science denomination. Last thing she said is, for those who are leaning on the sustaining infinite, to those who are leaning on God, today is big with blessings. So we all want blessings. We all want a blessed day, a happy life. The question is, how to bring that about? Well, Mary Baker Eddy points out, just as Bruno Gröning points out, just as Jesus Christ pointed out, that it's through leaning on God, trusting in God, connecting to God, relying on God. And that doesn't mean we just sit here and tune in and do nothing, but as we go throughout our day, the goal is to stay connected to God and be guided all throughout the day. And to really remember that God is the big bread giver. God is the source of all good. Given that we all want only the good, it kind of makes sense to turn to God. So I'm going to read that one more time, and then let's spend a little time in silence, reflecting on our task to lean on God. The reminder that we're leaning on God because God is that which sustains us. And that it's through doing that that blessings and a good life come. Again, to those leaning on the sustaining infinite, today is big with blessings. So let's do that. Let's lean on the sustaining infinite and open ourselves to receive big blessings. So we take in this energy, remembering that all things are possible through God. Here's a quote from Bruno. Therefore, I give you one good piece of advice, dear friends, as you are in need of the divine order. It is your duty and obligation to connect yourself with God, with all the good that God has decreed for us, for each one of us. So that's our duty. That's our obligation to connect to God and receive the good. However, if we don't recognize that we need God, we're not going to seek God. And as Bruno Grenade says here, he says, I give you one good piece of advice as you are in need of the divine order. If I don't recognize that I have thirst, I'm not going to go drink something. If I don't recognize the need for God, or in this case, divine order, which, I believe Bruno said that order, Ordnung, harmony, is God. I'm drawing from memory on that one, so my apologies if that's. You would sometimes use them seemingly interchangeably. But so we need to recognize our need. And as I started out talking in the beginning, we need to recognize that we're not able on our own. If I was able to create divine harmony, harmony in my body, in my mind, in my heart, in my life, I wouldn't need the teaching of Bruno Gurney. But I can't, not on my own. That's the humility piece. I'm not able to, on my own, without these teachings and without divine help, to just eliminate illness from my body. If I was, I wouldn't need God in a sense, and I certainly wouldn't need this teaching. That's where the humility comes in. That humility opens us. And we can, again, with the analogy of water, it's so important to recognize our need for God. Again, if I don't recognize that I'm thirsty, if I don't recognize a need, I'm not going to do something to meet it. And, the world today is not so God-centered. If I don't recognize the need for God and I walk out my front door, it's not like there are billboards that are gonna, be like, hey, don't forget to get some God today. The billboards are gonna be like, don't forget to have a cigarette today, and don't forget to lose some weight today, and so forth and so on. That's kind of the message out there. The sort of the message of the world, meaning what I mean by that is sort of the secular world or a materially minded world, is we don't need God. So, this work we're doing is recovering from that, what I would call delusion. But I would also call it just getting in touch with the simple truth. The simple truth meaning we need the divine. We're utterly dependent on the divine. It's our source and it's our sustainer. And I found out firsthand what a life looks like when you get really far away from God. And I would argue that the world we see, sort of the state of the state of the world right now, is sort of an experiment of like, well, what happens when we move away from God? And I'm personally ready for that experiment to end. So let's spend a little time recognizing our need And you may have your own words. And if anything I say, I'm not a master. If anything I say doesn't resonate, please find your own words. Hopefully I'm accurately expressing what Bruno Grunny taught. I believe I am. If I'm not, please drop me an email. I really want to know. And so let's spend a little time in silence. And again, you may have your own words. The words that work for me is my need for God, my reliance on God, my dependence on God. Bruno Grunny said, only God can help us. Doesn't get much simpler than that. And if you have your own way of expressing this truth we're looking at, please type it in. I'd love to hear it, and I'll share it with the meeting. Let's spend a little time recognizing our need for God. And not just recognizing it and then taking it in, fulfilling that need. Receiving all the good God has in store for us. So, as adults, we like to think that have all we have it all together, that we're in charge, that we're competent and we're capable. I don't want to say that those things aren't true. And once Bruno Grenier pointed out that just because these bodies are bigger doesn't mean that we're actually no longer children. And in fact, he said that's our problem, is that we've become all grown up and we think we're all. Now, having confidence in oneself is not necessarily a bad thing, but having confidence in oneself can then also lead us on off of the path of relying and depending on God. So it's a very fine line. We don't want to. Well, I'll just stick with what Bruno said. He said something to the effect of, "But many people are all grown up." And speaking of himself, he said, "But I am and remain a child, only a child of God." So that can be hard. It can be hard for us. It's certainly hard for me as an adult um, to acknowledge, admit, and much less recognize, much less live in it with a feeling of dependence, not on people, not on an employer, but dependence on God. But even so, to cultivate that attitude, it's a very subtle topic because if you just hold your breath, it becomes very apparent very quickly how dependent on air we are, right? Like under a minute, you will have um, it'll become quite apparent. Oh my God, I need air, and that feeling just increases and increases and increases with every second. But with this subject of dependence on God, it's very easy to fool ourselves on this subject. You know, um, and just in this moment, I'm having images of, I just saw in the, I was reading through a magazine and it was like some article about someone's $88 million house in some exclusive part of California. I don't remember where. It's like, well, if I had billions of dollars to where I could afford an $88 million, and I'm sure that's just one of their toys. How easy is it to not feel like I would need God? I could have people wait on me. Um, I could snap my fingers and all day long. In a sense, whatever I wanted in a material sense, very easy to fool ourselves. So that's an extreme example, but not such an extreme example is, you know, yes, we go to work to earn money, so we buy food, but um, how easy is it to just walk into a grocery store and hand over some money and receive some food back? Whereas a couple hundred years ago, the majority of the people were, you know, um, literally, it was quite clear to them that they were dependent on God because they were farming, and one bad season could mean death. Um, Not just for them as individuals, but their whole family or their whole community. But we've removed ourselves not just from God, but from nature. We have this. It's very easy. I've got a little money in the bank. I've got a house. I've got a car. You know, it's very easy to feel falsely powerful. and falsely independent. Now, I'm not denying that a car or money is a certain type of power. But what's coming to me more and more is that all these toys we have, some of them very powerful toys, are just toys, and that we're actually just children, and that we really are utterly and completely dependent on the divine. And I didn't clue into this part of Bruno Gruning's teachings till I actually read something from another teacher. And I've shared this before in Community Hour. It's an Indian teacher named Ramana Maharshi. And he was speaking about that he said there's only two ways. And here he was talking about enlightenment, two ways to God. One is to inquire deeply and recognize that the divine lives within us, which I had heard about. That's a very common Indian philosophy teaching. The second, he said, was to admit our inability, that we require a higher power to help us. That's almost a verbatim quote. When I read that, I just recognized that that's the essence of what Bruno was teaching us. Not just that there is a higher power that helps and heals, but this recognition of, as Ramana Maharshi said, I admit my inability. I require the help of a higher power. Because it's one thing to be like, yes, nothing's incurable, nothing's impossible. But again, if I don't recognize, admit, as Mary Baker Eddy said, lean on, as Bruno said, recognize that only God can help us, I'm not going to turn to that. I'm not going to seek it out. Or, I'll seek it out. I'll do my morning Einstellung and my evening Einstellung and not seek it out throughout the day. And not seek it as if my life depends on it. So Bruno Gruning said many things, but to me they all really boil down to this recognition of the existence of a higher power, the existence that God is limitless in his capacity to help us and is limitless, is available to help. And then here comes the hard one, which I've been talking about a lot today, the recognition of our need for that help. That to me, and then of course Bruno offers ways for us to receive that help through Einstellung. And then when you combine those three together, that's to me the essence of faith and trust. That's how I make sense of Bruno Gruning's teachings. And the interesting thing is, Bruno Gruning's not in his body anymore. So there's this interesting, on the one hand, I'm sometimes very sad about that. I was like, I have 1,000 questions. Of course, Bruno would probably answer some of them, and then many of them he would point back to me and ask me to tune in and receive those answers. But now that Bruno Gruning's not in his body, we're left with this interesting task of taking his teachings and really finding out for ourselves what he meant, right? If Bruno Gruning was here, I could be like, hey, Bruno, it seems to me that the essence of what you taught was to rely on God. Is that true? Or, what do you think of this Mary Baker Eddy quote? Or what do you think of what this quote from Ramana Maharshi? But what I'm left with, and what each one of us are left with, is we can look to Bruno's teachings, but ultimately it has to come alive inside ourselves. We have to, as Bruno said, convince ourselves of the truth, have an inner understanding and hopefully an inner awakening, maybe a recognition. I'm reminded of what Bruno spoke of when he talked about the Bible, and he encouraged, at least in this case, Lilo, who was Alfred Hosp's wife. He said, read the Bible often. It has much wisdom. And he said, not to paraphrase, he said, don't get so hung up on the words. Hung up. I don't think Bruno would have said that, but that's California me. But, but in essence, he said, the words in and of themselves are dead. But what matters is what comes alive in us as we read them. He said, don't focus so much on the meaning of the words, but what comes alive inside of us as we read them. And that's the same thing. I take that approach with now anything I study, whether it be Bruno Gröning or Mary Baker Eddy, is what comes alive in me. So maybe that's a long way of saying that, on this path, we have Bruno Gröning to guide us and to nudge us and to point us in the right direction. And we also have this duty, this obligation to connect to God and to reflect deeply and listen inside of ourselves. We had a member, and this member's here today. I don't know if they're comfortable me mentioning their name because this is being recorded and be on YouTube. If you are, just type OK. And this member wrote me and said that they were reading the Bible and looking for answers and not quite coming. That it was almost as if it was kind of creating more confusion. And then they heard a voice which they felt was Christ speaking. And I'm having to paraphrase here. And the voice said, "Close the book and open your hands." And in essence, receive the truth. And I think that, and I'm very grateful to that person for sharing that with me. I think that's maybe, everything I've talked about today, and maybe everything that Bruno Gröning spoke about, is to lead us to that point, is to guide us to that point where, and that person's here. So if I got any of the words wrong, please correct me. To get us to that point where we're in communion, which is one of the meanings of the German word Verbindung that Bruno Gröning used, to be in communion and communication with God directly. I think that's what ultimately Bruno Gröning was pointing us towards. All right, we'll begin wrapping up. For those who are joining via YouTube, I have a website, www.thehealingstream.org. Aw, I just had someone from Poland. Looks like Anya. Oh, you're welcome, Anya. That's so beautiful. Thank you so much. So I have a website. I'm going to type it in. And if you would like to be on my mailing list, let's see, did I get it right? No, I just typed it in wrong. I'm going to type it again. The first time I typed it in, it's wrong. I almost typed it in the German. It's thehealingcurrent@gmail.com, and the website is thehealingstream.org. So welcome, a warm welcome, Anya. Welcome from Poland. Thank you for joining in. And so let's spend a little time in silence, and let's do that. In a sense, if you want to, forget everything I've said. Let everything I say just be a pointer towards that, opening our hands, opening our hearts, our souls, our beings, our bodies, and communing with God, receiving that direct connection. And spend a little time in silence. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. I will send out information about the next community hour. Welcome to everyone who's new. Thank you so much. If you'd like info about the next gathering, then please do send me an email and I can put you on my email list. I wish you all a glorious, as Mary Baker Eddy said, a day or night full of big blessings. Big blessings. I wish all of us, including me, the remembrance. What's the source of big blessings? It's the divine. And actually, I'd like to close with a quote of Bruno's. One moment while I pull it up. Let us recognize the divine in everyone, learn to love it more and more, and to respect everyone. In this way, we can become completely one with God and mankind. So I wish you a day of recognizing the divine in everyone, which includes ourselves. Thank you so much, divine creations, divine marvels, children of God. I'll see and feel you all very soon. Take care. So much love.